Is it still feeling cold? Is it now going?
Yeah.
I'm Negley Harte, and it's the 17th of March 2001, and I'm in Oxford talking to Professor Sir John Habakkuk. Thinking of the history of the Economic History Society, there aren't very many people whose memory goes back to the first period, that 20-year period when it was struggling to keep up its membership numbers. And you must be one of the few people who remember Eileen Power, who was really the founder of the society.
I remember Eileen Power very well. Along with the rest of the LSE, she migrated to Cambridge in the first year of the war, and she ran a seminar. She ran a seminar in her home, 2 Sylvester Road, and it was a very exhilarating experience for me. R.L. Smith, who wrote on the Estates of Canterbury, was a member.
Oh, yes.
Marjorie Chibnall, as she became, and Elizabeth Crittall.
Oh, yes.
And I think that Edward Miller occasionally appeared. But it was extremely stimulating. And she was a very effective organizer of a seminar. She brought people out. She made you feel really cleverer and more learned than nature intended you to be.
But you hadn't met her before then, though you had met Poston several years before.
Well, I had met her before, very casually. She came to lecture at Girton, the founders' lecture at Girton, before she married Poston. And Poston and I walked back into Cambridge, and I had no idea of what their relations were. And in the way in which young people are, I was highly critical of her lecture. And then the next morning, I think, the news of their engagement was announced. And it was one of the nice things about Poston is that he didn't hold those remarks against me.
You had gone to Poston's lectures as soon as he came to Cambridge, in would that have been 34 or 35?
No, he came in October 34.
34.
And I went to the first course of lectures he gave. It was on movements of European labour and capital in the 19th century. And as I later learned, it was very much Zombart. And they were quite electrifying. They were extremely well organised. They were easy to take notes from. They introduced you to a world of literature which was entirely strange. And they were a great contrast with Clapham's lectures, which were also fascinating, but which I attended in 33, 34, but fascinating in quite a different way. I mean, they consisted of a mixture of anecdote and luminous generalization, reinforced by a very powerful personality. They weren't easy to take notes from, but you listened and you remembered things.
Did Clapham give a lot of information?
Oh, he gave an enormous amount.
And was he starting in sort of 1066 or
He
1485?
He started with the Dark Iberians,
Ah.
and 3 lectures a week at 9 o'clock, absolutely packed, and he lectured throughout the 3 terms, and he came down to the present day. And it was very evenly balanced, that's to say, and it was very up to date, I've no doubt, and it was very exhilarating and it was very memorable. It wasn't easy to take notes. There was curiously little analysis. There were these sudden generalizations, and there was a great deal of information, and there was a great deal of sort of telling anecdotes from the sources. He was a great mystery to me, Clapham, because he'd been one of Marshall's favourite pupils. He advised Marshall on the historical sections of the Trade and Industry volume, which are highly analytical. He'd been a professor of economics at Leeds for many years. I once bought a book of his after his death, Cassell's The Nature and Necessity of Interest, a highly theoretical book and full of his annotations. But in his lectures, he never betrayed the slightest interest in a theoretical framework,
Right.
and I don't know why.
And would you say this was economic history in a sort of classic sense as opposed to social history? Or would you say that there was social history and economic history intertwined?
It was more
in Clapham?
economic. I mean, there was a lot of social history because he covered an awful lot of ground, but it was primarily economic history.
And entirely about Britain. He had, of course,
was,
continental
well,
interests and strong French interests, but he
no.
didn't lecture on that.
No, he didn't lecture on. Well, he did lecture, but I didn't attend his lectures. I think he'd given them up by the time I lectured. I mean, he'd published his book. Parallels would be drawn with continental development, but he didn't directly talk about the continent.
But there's a contrast here with Poston, because Poston would have been analytical and theoretical and very continental,
Yes.
in various meanings of that,
Yes.
I suppose, and quite consciously bringing in or treating history as one of the social sciences.
Oh, he was very consciously analytical and social scientist, and Clapham wasn't. But let me tell you a story about Clapham, which illustrates one side of him. Mark Bloch came to Oxford in 38 and again in 39, and I don't know to which year this story relates. But Clapham and Lady Clapham invited all the economic historians to meet him, to meet Bloch and Mrs. Bloch. Saltmarsh was there and Poston was there. And they spoke English, because Bloch spoke extremely good English. And Bloch was very effervescent, very analytical, full of wild generalizations. And Clapham was doing his stolid Yorkshireman, you know, occasionally putting the boot in and occasionally a devastating subclause. And then Lady Clapham, who was a very sensitive person, noticed that Madame Bloch wasn't in fact taking part in the conversation. So she said, "We will now talk French." And the tables were completely turned. Suddenly, Clapham started talking in extremely fluent French. Generalization after generalization about European economic history. Bloch became reticent, cautious, rather Anglo-Saxon. And it tells you something about the relation of language and psychology and history.
Was this an occasion that Eileen Power
No,
would have been at?
no, it must, no, which probably means it was 38. I don't remember Eileen Power being there.
But this seminar was 39-40, and obviously she died in 1940, so it wasn't repeated in the second year.
No, no, this was her last seminar. Yes.
Now, did you join the Economic History Society around this time?
I don't know when I joined. My first conference, I remember, was at the LSE when I was still a civil servant, and I think must have been in 46. It was at the LSE.
Just for a day?
Just for a day. And I remember two things very vividly. One is that Ashton brought along a man called J.F. Rees,
Oh, yes.
who had been who was the author of two textbooks, one on economic and social and the other on monetary and fiscal policy in the 19th century, and wrote an extremely good chapter on mercantilism in the Cambridge history of the empire, but had left the subject and had become principal of University College Cardiff. And I remember Ashton bringing him in. And the second thing I remember is a paper by Poston in which I put hostile questions to him, and I used the word resources, and Poston said, "You mustn't use resources, you must say what you mean. You must say men or money or women or fields, but you mustn't use this vague, misleading term."
A small gathering, I suppose.
A small gathering of, I imagine, about 20, 25. We sat around a table.
Right. And I gather that those conferences happened after the war up to
Yes.
49.
Yes.
And then there was the decision to move to having residential conferences, the first of which was at Birmingham in 1950. Now, did you go to that?
I don't think I did, and it must be because I was busy moving a family from Cambridge to Oxford. Because I'm sure I would remember. I don't remember a thing about it.
And the second residential conference was in fact here in Oxford, and you were the organiser of that, except you had Michael Thompson as your research student too.
Michael Thompson did the effective organisation. I remember it. It was extremely cold. We had it at Worcester because Asa Briggs was a fellow of Worcester and he was reader in economic history. It was quite a small conference. What I remember about that was a series of papers on the trade cycle. R.S. Sayers wrote a paper on the trade cycle. Neville Ward Perkins, a young Oxford economic historian who died very soon after, did 1847 and thereabouts. And Eric Hobsbawm did a paper on the social aspects in the later 19th century, which was published in the review.
Yeah. And wasn't Rostow there too?
I don't remember Rostow. The man I do remember was Redford. Redford was a very pertinacious questioner, both of Sayers and of Neville Ward Perkins. Very acute.
Now this was, of course, the early 50s was the beginnings, we now know, of a very prolonged boom period,
yes.
A boom generation for economic history. All the statistical indicators of numbers of professors and numbers of members and numbers of students are increasing all through the 50s and 60s. Were you conscious when you came first to Oxford in 1950 that this was about to happen?
I was conscious of it in the 3 post-war years when I was external examiner at the LSE. 46, 47, 48, I think. Ashton had just come there. There was Beales, there was Caris Wilson, and there was Fisher. And the papers, when I read them, were extraordinary. They were brilliant papers. And they include, as I now know, a number of people who were terribly important in economic history. I only knew them as numbers, I didn't know them, but I must have examined Eversley, and Coleman, and Davis, you know, who wrote on trade and went to Hull. And there were several others. I mean, the economic history papers were an enormous revelation to me, and no doubt this was partly because the lectures were extremely good. There's no doubt about it. They must have been extremely good lectures, but they had attracted many of the very brightest candidates. So I thought then that it was a subject on the rise.
Right. And of course, as the 50s went on, and well, by the 60s, many of those people were getting chairs.
Yes.
Ralph Davis
Yes.
at Leicester.
Minchington was another.
Minchington.
Yes.
Yes. There was quite a cohort. I think it was the year Don Coleman graduated. Was it 48? I think there was perhaps half a dozen firsts.
Yes.
All of them, including I think Tony Bridbury and maybe Sidney Pollard.
That's right, Sidney Pollard. No, they were an extraordinary group of people.
And some of them were students of, well, they were all students of Ashton's, were they? And some of them were students of Jack Fisher and some of
Well, Eversley,
Beales.
Eversley was a pupil of Beales. I mean, I don't know the sociology of the history of the economic history department of the LSE. Ashton was appointed what, 45, 46?
45, yes.
45.
Actually 44, actually 44.
And I don't think there's any secret about the fact that there was a certain amount of local resentment and people felt that Beales. There were certainly feelings that Tawney ought to have supported Beales instead of, as he certainly did, support Ashton. When I started examining for them, I saw a great deal of Beales and Ashton, and they were quite close friends. They were ideologically widely different. Intellectually they were widely different because Beales was very fertile but rather rambling, whereas Ashton was dead on the ball. But I saw a great deal of them, and they were obviously very friendly, as of course were Ashton and Tawney. I heard Ashton and Tawney arguing about economics. And I remember Ashton complaining bitterly about all the bread that was wasted feeding the ducks in St James's Park, entirely due to food subsidies, not properly pricing your commodities. But it didn't prevent Ashton having the dedication of the Cranfield book. And my impression was that it was not only an extremely effective teaching department, but that it was a very friendly department, at least judged by the standards of Cambridge economics.
Ah, goodness. Let's come back to Cambridge. Ashton, of course, hadn't been a pupil of Clapham's, but is really sort of Clapham's. He's in the same intellectual tradition, am I right in supposing? And I imagine that you would find T.S. Ashton's approaches to history rather congenial too, because he was, of course, a historian, but he was interested in using, where appropriate, economic theory and economic techniques.
I mean, he was very much more interested in using theory. He wasn't such a robust, dominating personality as Clapham. Clapham was a very big-boned man, and he had a big mind, and he had very wide interests. You know, he wrote a famous article on the horsing of the Danes and things like that. Ashton was the ideal type of a Lancashire man. He was thrifty, he was prudent, he was very equable, he had no chips on his shoulders, he was extraordinarily good with pupils, and I was a pupil of his. I used to attend his seminar. He was extraordinarily good at drawing you out. I had an undergraduate pupil who went as a lecturer, K.G. Davis, to the LSE, who again was ideologically quite different from Ashton, who said Ashton was extraordinarily good at introducing him to the institution, to the department, to the subject. And of course, he applied his theory, and it was very systematic theory. I mean, he was a good Marshallian, and it showed through in a way which it never showed through with Clapham. His main prejudice was he didn't like the government. He didn't like government. So that he was he was pro-Marshall and he was anti-Cunningham.
Very Manchester.
And he'd been taught economics theory by a man called Sidney Chapman, who was a pupil. And he once made a reference to Chapman, saying what a splendid teacher he was, and then implying he'd gone to the bad. And I often wondered what had happened. When I became a civil servant, I discovered what had happened to him. He'd become senior economic advisor to the Board of Trade in the First World War, and an extremely successful civil servant. But he'd sold out to the enemy. Well, I got quite different things from Clapham and Ashton, although I worshipped them both. I used to go to Clapham. I never registered for a PhD, one didn't in those days, but I used to go to a weekly session which Clapham had. And Clapham in those days was very deeply involved in the work of some society for getting German Jewish scholars out of Germany. And he was to open his correspondence and at the same time listen to me. And occasionally, he knew nothing whatever about the subject, which was landowners. Occasionally he would make a very penetrating observation which would send me back to the records. But it was all terribly amateur. You know, they never stand for it now. But you felt you were in contact with a remarkable man, with a very active mind. And it was reassuring.
Now, Poston is there for a few years as a lecturer, but of course in 1938 he's chosen to succeed Clapham as the professor.
Yes.
Now, did that make for lots of changes in Cambridge?
It meant that the Poston seminar, became the focal point. I don't remember Clapham running a seminar. I went to him one-to-one, and I do remember the first year of Poston seminar, which was quite electrifying. He was an extraordinarily good conductor of the seminar. He always found interesting things to say and points to establish or hypotheses to be produced for verification. He was quite a different personality from Clapham.
You continue to have a lot to do with Boston because, of course, when you came here to Oxford, you became joint editor of the Economic History Review alongside Boston.
I had a lot to do with Boston before I left Cambridge. When I came back to Cambridge, he persuaded me to share with him an economic history special subject. In Cambridge they had special subjects. And he wanted to put one on the British economy from, what, 1860 to 1939.
Can I interrupt with a question that's always puzzled me about Boston? Did Boston have these 20th century, late 19th to 20th century interests before the war?
Well,
or did they generate themselves because of the war?
They were rather exiguous before the war, but as I say, he did lecture, regurgitating Zombart mainly, and presumably lectures he'd given at the LSE on movements of labour and capital in the 19th century. But of course all his research interests were in medieval history. And what changed him, of course, was the war history.
Yes.
And when he came back to Cambridge, he was writing the history of the munitions industry, and he was reading the background literature on the economic history of the period up to 1939. So this fitted in with his interests. I'd been in the Board of Trade in the later part of the war, and I was one of the joint secretaries of the pre-Bretton Woods talks. So I'd become interested in the international economic history of the 1930s. So he did the internal organization of the economy one term, and the second term I did the growth of the international economy between 1860 and 1939.
This is when you went back to Cambridge after
the war. I went back and was plunged into it in October '46 and started with him.
So teaching with him, but then you become assistant editor of the review for a couple of years,
in
and
46.
then you become joint editor.
I became joint editor when I came here.
When you came here, and did you run it jointly, or did he think did how can I put this? Did Boston think he was still running it?
No, Boston, in a way in which perhaps many people wouldn't think, he was an extremely conscientious editor, and he was very good at the technical business of counting the number of words and doing the proofs. He had very little secretarial help. I think Cynthia may have done quite a lot.
Yes.
But he was not only ingenious in the sense of thinking up new items, he was also very good at the pedestrian side. When I came to Oxford, it was a free and equal relationship. It moved to Oxford because, he felt after a time that he'd done it. Also because Max Hartwell was assistant editor. Max Hartwell was an extremely good assistant editor, a very good editor, and he had the facilities of Nuffield. And I think perhaps for the first time, the Economic History Review had something like adequate technical facilities. For example, Max and his secretary did the index of the early volumes, which we couldn't have done without Nuffield.
Yes. Yes. And Boston, of course, had somehow kept the review going through the war years.
He kept it going through the war years.
There were slim issues, but they did appear.
They did appear. And as I say, that must have been Boston by himself. He was a very hard worker, Boston. It's something which...
He was always extremely good value because he always had something to say. It was not necessarily right or necessarily appropriate, but he always said it with enormous verve, and he was always enormously kind to me.
Yes.
Who he had absolutely no a connection or official reason to be nice to me as a research student at LSE, but he went out of his way on many occasions to be
He was a very,
kind.
very generous man. I always remember I was at a party at Girton, and Boston was there, and he discovered that I had got engaged without telling him, and he was peeved. He thought that our relations were such that I should really have told him of these steps. He gathered my fiancée, who had just taken her degree, and myself. He drove us back to 2 Sylvester Road, and he and Cynthia broke a bottle of champagne and drank our health. And he was very capable of that generous instinct. He was rash in intellectual argument. You know, he pushed arguments to their limit. But let me tell you, I told you a story about Clapham. Let me tell you a story about Boston, in which I don't figure well. Boston loved arguing, and he liked winning arguments. And I always suspected he had this enormous range of literature in many languages, and I always suspected him in a corner of inventing books. And one day we were talking about the Industrial Revolution, and he really fell into my hands, because he quoted a book. Well, I'm speaking from memory now, and it may be wrong. It was Rees or Jones or Williams, some old South Welsh ironworks. And I said, Munia, there is no such book. You know, I may not know the literature widely, but South Wales, I'm a South Walian, I know it. Just then we saw Arthur John coming, and I called him over, because he really knows about it, he really knew about it. And I said, is there such a book as Jones, some old South Welsh ironworks? And I'm afraid Arthur John completely let me down. And he misconstrued the situation, because he turned to Boston and he said, well, of course there's a book called Jones, some old South Welsh ironworks. It's not widely known, but it's certainly known to anyone who chooses to pontificate about this subject. There's such a book, it contains what Boston said it contained. Well, it was a nice sight, he didn't crow. To this day, I don't know. It must be, you know, for a time he was Tawney's research assistant when Tawney and Parr were doing the economic documents. And so he looked up all sorts of economic documents. And he knew sources you didn't expect him to know. I think it may be that. However.
But he was terribly good at making things up. And of course the whole question of his origins are very, I don't know if you ever got it clear in your own mind.
Well, I had a colleague, a visiting fellow at All Souls, who was writing, he says he's writing, he's a man called Razi.
Oh yes.
Medieval, and
yes.
He says he's got it clear.
Right.
But I always found Boston much more reliable than anyone ever said. That's to say, when I presumed that he wasn't reliable, he turned out to be reliable. And he was enormously stimulating. And it was he put me on to my research subject.
Landowners?
What? Landowners.
Really?
Well, my first research subject was the influence of Dutch theologians on English political thought in the 17th century.
Oh.
I had a contact with Harold Lasky, who had come to talk to an undergraduate society I ran, and I wrote to him. And he gave me very good advice. He said, no one has done, who was that 18th century philosopher who proved the deity from the existence of a deity from a clock? Forgotten his name now. And he said Arthur Young has never been done either. And he said those two have the great advantage that all their stuff is in the Cambridge University Library and you won't have to go over the country. Then when I got into contact with Clapham, he said, well, you come from South Wales, go and do South Wales Industrial Revolution in. But for some reason I was anti my origins at that stage. And I bumped into Boston, who'd just come back from visiting Joan Wake at the Northampton Record Society. He'd been looking at the manuscript which became his edition of the Cartai Native Autumn, which is about medieval peasants, and he said the record of is absolutely stiff with 17th and 18th century estate records. He said you can't go wrong. It's a subject in which there's virtually nothing and there's plenty of sources. And I went off and did it, foolishly as I now think.
Surely not.
Yes, foolishly.
You're not regretting that Boston rescued you for economic history.
Well, I regret that I didn't do South Wales. I would have done it along with Arthur John, who was an exact contemporary of mine, and we would have both, shared out the division. And the documents and the literature was much more amenable. I was plunged into the original manuscript sources of a highly legal subject. And what I should have done is start on the 19th century and the printed private acts. And Clapham, it's very curious, Clapham was the man ideally suited because he read all the late 19th century Land Commission reports and things like that. But that's the way people worked in those days. They didn't intervene with your choices. They threw out ideas and they left it to you. But it was in a sense an accident that I didn't do Arthur Young, which is economic history of a sort.
I don't think Arthur Young has been properly done.
There is a book about him now by an American. It's a good book. But then there was nothing about him and they were all his writings.
And of course you continue to work on land ownership in its various regards, but you didn't only work upon that because you were led into various other interesting, quite major subjects.
Well, when I went back,
population.
yeah, when I went back to Cambridge, I was elected to a university lectureship in the economics faculty, and I was assigned to do the second year course, which was the economic history of the modern world. There was a first year course, which was English economic history, which was compulsory. There was a second year course. The first year course was done by C.R. Fay, and I was brought in to relieve him of the second year course. And I spent an enormous amount of time, and it was very stimulating, but it was nothing to do with English landowners. And it was a chaotic use of time. I mean, I read very widely, and I delivered for 2 terms, 3 lectures a week. And that left me with all sorts of interests, of which only one ever surfaced, which was labour scarcity. And then I came to Oxford and I changed shift again because there wasn't a market for modern economic history as lectured to economic historian, lectured to second year economists, whereas there was in Cambridge.
This is because the tradition of economics was much stronger in Cambridge than it was in Oxford.
Well, no, it was partly because that economic history were 2 compulsory papers in Cambridge because they were the alleviation of the economics tripos. In Oxford you didn't need it because you had PPE and the politics and the philosophy. They were the alleviation. So that the Oxford economists, apart from Hicks, and that's a separate story. I should have said, talking about Ashton, that John Hicks had an enormous admiration for Ashton and acquired his interest in economic history from Ashton. And of course Hicks left a fund to fund an annual lectureship here in economic history. And it's entirely Ashton's doing. But the point is that there wasn't a market for that sort of economic history here.
So your interests had to be given a slightly different speed.
Well, so I had to go back to...
But I wasn't going to ask you about Hicks, but you did mention C.R. Fay.
Yes.
Now, he's always struck me as being an appealing and eccentric figure.
Hicks was in some ways a tragic figure.
Fay.
He was, when I talk about Ashton as a typical Lancastrian, it shows you how absurd it is to talk about regional identities, because Ashton was eminently sane. You could always get a rational argument out of him. He was never wayward in argument or anything like that. C.R. Fay was very wayward in argument. He would get up at conference you know, he was like a great big lighthouse revolving. And he would say splendidly sensible things, and then he would say things you thought were absolutely impossible. He was a very learned man. He retained an interest in economic theory of quite a profound kind. I mean, when he learned I was interested in the rate of interest, he sent me a literature from quite recondite sources about the theories of the rate of interest. But he was very unsystematic. You know his 19th century England. It was widely praised by Keynes, but that shows what a loyal man Keynes was to his friends. Now, whether he got knocked up during the war.
He was quite old at the time he was speaking.
Oh, he was retiring. I mean, the reason I was appointed was that he was retiring, perhaps within a year or two of my appointment. So I only, you know, I used to see him before the war. I used to go and have tea with him. And he was a pupil of Marshall. But he was very eccentric. And he was an odd chap, but he was very learned, very generous. I remember him saying when Poston got the chair, which he might have had, I mean, he was the obvious local person, he was the breeder. He published infinitely more than Poston. He said he thought they'd made the right appointment, that Poston was a better professor than he would have been.
So Fay belonged to a sort of earlier generation of sort of, as it were, eccentric pioneers.
Well,
but once we get to the age of, shall I say, you and Poston, we're now into the age of efficiency as teachers and researchers of an already established subject, a mature subject, perhaps in its drive to maturity.
I would still say, looking at the figures you've kindly provided, there was a good deal of accident about the initial boom. And I would attribute it primarily to the LSE, to that grouping of people. I haven't mentioned A.V. Judges, but he's another. That grouping of teachers and that grouping of post-war bright boys who perhaps wouldn't have gone to a university in the normal course of events, who were slightly older. And then they went out into the universities. My own choice of economic history was, as I just said, almost accidental. Now, Charles Wilson chose economic history, although he could have chosen anything. I mean, by temperament, he was very much a generalist. The other man of my year, Michael Greenberg, also chose economic history. And that was partly because he was interested in imperialism, he was a Marxist, and partly because there was a block of documents, Jardine Matheson, in the local library, in the university library. And then Arthur John, of course, who came to Cambridge from the LSE, was also. So there was a group of us who were doing economic history, and who attended Poston Seminar. But there was something, there were accidental as well as systemic elements in it.
So there was this exciting period of growth and expansion on this basis through the 50s and through the 60s. But in the 60s, we began to get something that was sometimes rather aggressively called the new economic history.
Yes.
Now, I was talking about this to Joan Thirsk yesterday,
Yes.
and she made it quite clear how unsympathetic she was to it and repelled by it. Now, you must have had a more complicated reaction, because you wouldn't have been against the theory and the quantification. I take it I'm right in assuming.
No, because the essay on labour scarcity, I mean, is highly theoretical. I had a pupil who had some claim to be one of the pioneers of this. There was a man called Jonathan Hughes.
Yes.
Who did a thesis on the trade cycle in the 50s. You know, I inherited from Hicks an interest in the trade cycle, and I put pupils onto the trade cycle, and he did the trade cycle. But he went back to Northwestern University in 54 into the economics department. A man called Stanley Reiter was the main economist, and they did an attack on Clapham's article on the first 2,000 steamships, extracting very much more from the quantitative data than Clapham had. When I was in 54-5, I took Gershengren's place at Harvard for a year. And in the seminar, there were the authors of what has since become a famous article on the economics of slavery.
Yes.
One was a statistician who became a professor of statistics, the other was an economist. That was my first inkling that things were going a different way. But I was able to hold my own. I didn't feel that they were, you know, I thought they were economists who were fruitfully straying into my territory. And when I saw David Landis, you know, we spoke the same language, and Bill Parker, and they were both enormously learned people, and I greatly admired them. Then I went to Berkeley for a year as a research professor in 1962-63, and there were four of us who ran a seminar. There was Landis, there was Rozovsky, there was a man who'd written a book on railways, and I can't remember his name now. He went off into Latin American, and there was a fourth. But it was a wonderful seminar. But I had a vague inkling from this man who wrote a book on, I wish I could remember his name, on railways, that things were changing. I read his book, and he gave me the works of the Chicago man to read. Who's the econometric historian who won a Nobel Prize?
The two you were talking about earlier were Conrad and Mayer.
Conrad and Mayer.
Writing about
but they were writing mainly theoretical.
Yes.
In 62-63, I first came into contact with, I can't remember his name. And then this man who ultimately won 3 or 4 years ago, Vogel.
Oh, Vogel. Yes, Vogel.
And I went to conferences of the American Economic History Society, and I heard Vogel speak.
Right.
And I realized this was an entirely new voice. And Vogel was a very nice man. I mean, he was very approachable. He didn't behave as if he was the eminent man. He quite clearly was. But he used to send me, throughout the 60s and 70s, his published work. And when I came back to Oxford, the first pupil I had after I came back was G.R. Hawke. And I suggested to Hawke that he try to do for the English railways what Vogel had done for the American railways. And I got involved in some arguments on the validity of Vogel's methods, but I then realized that really the subject was getting beyond me. I think I could keep up with theory. I was 4 years a member of the economics faculty at Cambridge, and I was a year at Harvard and a year at Berkeley, again in the economics department. And I kept up in an amateur sort of way with theory, but I couldn't do the econometrics. I had never been trained. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why I was quite glad to leave the chair in '68.
Well, I was just about to ask
Yes.
that, whether there was some feeling that you were
Yes.
happy to give up a subject that you used to love
Yes.
at that time,
Well-
when you became Principal of Jesus.
Well, because of the accidents of history, I've always been torn. You see, the Northamptonshire gentry, they belonged to the history part of me. And in Pembroke College, I was the only historian. And I used to teach all the straight history I couldn't farm out. But in the faculty, I was in a faculty of economics, lecturing to economics students and expected to teach them economic history. And this was a tension which was partly resolved by coming to Oxford. But in a sense, it arose again in the 60s when I realized that economic history was becoming more econometric, and where the Northamptonshire gentry and the whole history of that social class belonged really to general history. So I was quite glad for a second time to have my dilemmas resolved by the invitation from Jesus, apart from the attraction of Jesus itself.
Now, the figures that I've produced for the membership of the Economic History Society, I think other quantitative indicators too, show that the last 25 years have in fact been a period of actual decline in the subject. Donald Colburn famously wrote a quirky but interesting account of economic history published in 1987 called The Rise and Decline of Economic History, and he was very alert to this. One of the reasons for it is the way that students have turned their backs on it in the way that we were talking about earlier. In my own particular case, teaching the Industrial Revolution, I now this year have 2 students in place of the 60 or 70 that I had all through the 70s and 80s. And I think that sort of thing has been replicated in departments of economic history throughout the country. People have turned away from that, at least in part because the influence of the American econometric historians has been to make students think that it's highly quantitative, arid, theoretical and boring, and that the human face has been lost. And meanwhile, of course, there's a very active social history and cultural history which has taken on some of the interests that economic history used to have. Now, is there anything in these thoughts that I'm suggesting?
I would say that in the post-war period, economic history was more fashionable than certain other types of history. In particular, than the history of high politics. I don't want to make too much of it because I think the choices were partly random. I think that what one forgets now is how very few research students there were before and immediately after the war, and how full of fruitful subjects all sections of history were. You only had to lift a stone and it was pullulating with interesting historical hypotheses and with sources which had never been looked at. And I think that this was one of the features which attracted people to economic history. The Northamptonshire Record Society was really a creation of the 30s and 40s. And I think too that Marxism had some play, and certainly in Cambridge, the structure of the school. It made people go for structural subjects, rather than narrative history, rather than the history of the great men. I mean, of my contemporaries, Brian Wormald went for Clarendon, and this was high politics. The relations between individuals and very small groups. And he had a great influence on me. We were research students together. But I realized he was doing a quite different sort of history. Now, I think this was partly a matter of intellectual fashion. Butterfield did high politics, you know, he did Lord North. But I think that more people went into economic and social history than went into high politics, or than went into intellectual history.
In the 30s and 40s?
In the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
Of a small total number. Now, I think that sometime in the 60s and 70s, just as economic history was becoming more specialized, and not only economic history, demographic history, intellectual history and the history of high politics was becoming more important, partly because of the 30-year rule, which opened the cabinet office papers, partly because of a reflection on the interwar period. I mean, when people talked about Hitler, as I remember it, in the 40s and 50s, we talked about it in terms of inflation and depression and the structure of land ownership in East Prussia. And then in the 60s, they started talking about the high politics and and Papen, and it was partly because the memoirs started coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something curiously crude about this sort of explanations which we'd put forward in the 50s, Jejeune, and they didn't correspond with the facts. And all the people at Peterhouse,
Mm-hmm.
started talking about the importance of high politics in the English context.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not merely the fact that economic history was taken over not only by econometrics, but by a higher class of theory. I mean, I remember vividly my book on labour scarcity was reviewed by a man called Temin.
Mm-hmm.
And I could object to nothing in the review. It was a very fair-minded review, but it did show some pretty significant muddles. Fruitful muddles, I like to think, but nevertheless, they were muddles. And there was a man called Paul David, whom I got to know at Harvard and again when he was at Stanford. And I talked economic history to him. And I mean, he was just more a master. Leaving econometric history aside, his theory was very much more relevant and powerful than mine, which is another reason why I made my exit when it came and went back to doing landowners. So I think if I had to explain these, I would say it was twofold. It was one, a change in the nature of economic history. Partly it became more econometric, and partly because changes in economic theory, particularly development theory, became much more powerful and much less accessible to the sort of generally interested economic historian. And the other thing is that the history of high politics and intellectual history and the history of science became more attractive.
Yes, I follow all of that. Georgia, is there something that you would like to ask?
I would like to ask the same question I asked to John Thirsk. What would you say to a young researcher starting now with a PhD or presenting a paper at Glasgow?
I would say come and do the economic history MPhil in Oxford. It's extremely flourishing. When I came to Oxford, there was no postgraduate qualification. I think mainly due to Charles Feinstein. There is now an MPhil in economic history, but also in other branches of history, like the history of science. And it is very attractive as one of a stable of sort of allied fields of history. And they get a lot of very clever people. And as to subject, I would say continental European economic history. Can I tell you one last story? And it involves Clapham. In 1938, I got a research fellowship at Pembroke College, Cambridge, which was to groom me for their history fellowship, because they didn't really have a history fellowship. And by that time, I got thwarted by the landowners. I realized that it was a highly technical legal subject, and I realized that all my documents were that high in manuscript. And I decided I wanted to retool myself. And I got permission of the college to apply for a Henry Fellowship to go and study railway history in Harvard. The two people who were the key electors to the Henry Fellowship were Clapham, my supervisor, and William Beveridge. I got a very nice letter when I failed to get it. I got a very nice letter from Clapham saying, Beveridge wanted to give it you. And I thought it was improper. I thought that you would set your hand to the plough in Northamptonshire, and you'd got a research fellowship at Pembroke, and you should jolly well sit in your bottom and finish it. And that shows Clapham. I think he was very honest. You know, he never did things behind your back, but he had very clear ideas as to what one should and shouldn't do. So I never went to Harvard. And
Well, except you did later.
I did in 54-5, yes, and that was an important year, but not as important as 38, 39. I then decided that since I had to stick to landowners, I would go and spend the year 38, 39, no, 39, 40, spending it 6 months with Bloch, and 6 months with a man called Hrothgar, who wrote on German land tenure. And then other things happened. But that would have been a very valuable year. I would have enlarged my horizons.
Very good. Well, there you covered quite a number of points that will interest us. I don't know if there's anything else that you would have wanted me to ask you that I haven't asked you, or if there's anything else you would have liked to have talked about.
No, I don't think so. I think I've been very lucky because all the economic historians I met were really very nice, generous people, particularly generous to their juniors. I'd like to mention one more, David Chambers. I externally worked for him at
Nottingham.
54 Nottingham. And again, there was, he was a splendid teacher of the subject and very, very attractive. And he got very good pupils. After all, it's an old Nottingham graduate who was the professor at Cambridge now.
It is another South Walian.
Another Barry boy.
Another Barry boy.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. You talked, when we were talking before the camera was on, about Jack Fisher.
Yes.
I don't know if you care to add a sentence sort of about Jack Fisher, who you've got to know when LSE came to Cambridge in 1939.
Yeah. I knew him well for the year 39-40, when he was at Cambridge in the LSE, and I got to know a number of the LSE people, and he was a revelation to me because he was slightly senior my contemporary, and he knew infinitely more economic history than I did, and he was full of ideas. I mean, there was more than a touch of Boston about him.
That might shock him.
That would shock him because he was very critical. I mean, much more critical than Boston. And then we were members together of the first economic history subcommittee of the Economic and Social History Society when it was set up. And he was a wonderful...
You're now in the mid-60s.
Now in the mid-60s. I've forgotten when it was set up, but I remember I was the first economic historian.
Something like 65 or 66.
That's right, and he joined us. And you could always rely, if you sent him a research proposal, that it would come back refereed brilliantly, but scrupulously and fairly. But I always thought it a great waste of his abilities, because they should have been devoted to producing his own work, and there was a blockage there. He wasted on other people, on refereeing other people's work, talents which were meant for the profession generally.
He was a devastating critic, in every level, and he put so much effort into that he found it impossible or very difficult to be creative himself, except that he did give very splendidly memorable lectures.
Well,
and every lecture he gave, whether it was an ordinary lecture for teaching or a lecture to a student society, each of them were newly and especially freshly composed.
Well, I remember giving, it must have been to a seminar in London or a paper, which he taught to bits afterwards, and he ripped it to bits. And it wasn't offensive, I mean, it wasn't malicious. Uh, but if he applied the same standards to himself, you can quite see why he didn't. I'd like to mention one more thing. It's partly how I started in economic history. I did a paper in economic history at school. And I was given by my schoolmaster the sections of Adam Smith on the rise of commercial civilization. But I was also given as a textbook, because my history master had spent a year in Columbia, I was given Usher's Industrial History of England,
Oh, yeah.
which I think is I haven't read it for decades. I thought it was a wonderful book.
Oh, yes.
So that I was predisposed.
Yes.
I was inoculated in favour of.
And your first teacher, when you found yourself in Cambridge, was Clapham or Vere Lawrence?
Oh no, I went to both lectures. I went to Vere Lawrence, but I went to Clapham because I realised that Clapham was the real stuff. You know, that he was on the frontiers, whereas Vere Lawrence was a man who had once had a fine mind, and was still capable of great clarity, but really didn't know much economic history. Well, it was quite clear that Clapham was bulging, he was overflowing, and it was infectious. Contagious is what I mean.